In the grand tapestry of human history, threaded with the rise and fall of empires, the birth and death of civilizations, one peculiar practice has woven its sinister strand through the ages: inbreeding. From the royal houses of Europe to the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, the corridors of power have echoed with this disturbing melody. But what were the ramifications of this practice, and how did it shape the course of history? History is rife with stories of inbreeding that are deeply rooted in early human civilizations. You must have had time to consider the problem. I think it is best to continue the triumvirate. This practice was especially prevalent in the royal families. Born out of a desire to keep the bloodline pure and unadulterated, this practice has gradually woven itself into the fabrics of human history. Join us today as we attempt to unravel the origin of this practice and how it has helped shape the development of our society. This is the history of inbreeding, its ramifications, and how it shaped the course of history. Keeping it in the family. The complicated history of inbreeding. A good place to start this video is to take you down the history of inbreeding in the development of human society. If your curiosity is as piqued as ours, pay attention as we take a deep dive into the evolution of human civilization and its interconnection with inter-siblings relationships and marriages. What form of relationship can be considered inbreeding? When did such a bizarre practice start? And how did it become such a normalcy in ancient times? We know it's a lot to unpack. The Greeks of early times considered those who suffered from it to be facing by the goth. So we'll make it easy for you by starting from the very explanation of what inbreeding is. By definition, inbreeding is considered as the mating of individuals or organisms closely related through common ancestry. We know you may be quick to say, according to this definition, every human is a product of inbreeding. After all, where else would the first desirable mate have come from but the very blood relation of the first man? Biblical speaking, it is unclear who were the companions of Cain and Abel, the first human siblings. According to Christian beliefs, could it have been the mother Eve? Or who else would they have been able to mate with, perhaps an unrecorded sister, before we get in over our heads on this controversial discourse? Remember, that's not our major focus in this video. This is a topic for another day. However, this historical record shows that even from the very beginning of human society, inbreeding has been a crucial part of our growth and development. From the very start of our civilization, humans have been interbreeding. Marriages between siblings, distant relations, and even parent and child are not an uncommon feature of human history. As a matter of fact, inbreeding may even be more interwoven into the very fabrics of our existence than you realize. But how did this practice become so common? Well, you should understand that at the genesis of human evolution, we were not as plenty as we are today. By the recent population census, there are 8 billion people on Earth. Take that in. For a moment, there are 8 billion humans. Just like you walking the face of the earth as we speak, people die and people are born, but the figure remains constant. In this age, there's really no reason for you to need to marry someone related to you. However, back in the early days of our evolution, our ancestors lived in small, isolated populations. So you know, inbreeding was not just a pleasure but a necessity. In order to ensure the survival of the bloodline, imagine an ancient human community filled with just a few 1,000 individuals. How else would they proliferate and expand their territory except by mating with the members of their own families? These families also prefer to be inbred so as to maintain the continuity of some desired traits in the offsprings that are born into the families. What other way would be effective in keeping the purity of your bloodline than by keeping it in the family? According to a study made in 2101.2 million years ago, there were only about 18,500 humans spread across the earth. Therefore, it was essential that the local communities remained inbred if they didn't want to be wiped out from the face of the earth. Fast forward to a couple 1,000 years ago, and inbreeding took on a more political form. A trip through the history of Egypt and some European royal families will reveal how deeply rooted this practice was. As a matter of fact, would you believe that an entire Spain dynasty was wiped out due to inbreeding, leading to a massive war for the throne? We'll get into that in a bit, so make sure you stick around while we understand why such a practice was a necessity for the survival of the early humans. The question is how it became so commonplace in ancient civilized societies and why it has continued for many years despite the obvious negative effects it has on our genetic makeup and the upcoming generation. Let us walk this historical path together as we take a look at some of the ancient civilizations that imbibed the culture of inbreeding, especially into their royal bloodlines. Why did they do it? And what effect did this practice have on their society? Pay attention, because we're about to get into the most interesting part of this video. Pharaonic family ties. The history of inbreeding in ancient Egypt. Welcome to the hallmark of ancient civilizations, ancient Egypt. Some thousands of years ago, the grandeur of this land was like that of the world powers we know today. You could call it the Paris or France, or even the United States of its day. But when you peer deep into its households, especially the royal families, you discover a string of inbreeding that spans generations for over 3,000 years, that the Egyptian civilization was on the pedestal. The pharaohs were like the gods of the land. You should know that these rulers did not consider themselves as ordinary humans. They were the representatives of the gods on earth, and they often strived to emulate them in words and in deeds. So let us introduce you to Osiris and Isis, two of the most important deities in the land at the time. Now you're probably wondering, hey, this is a video about inbreeding. So why are we talking about ancient Egyptian gods? Well, that is because these gods played a huge role in the popularity of inbreeding among royal Egyptian families. So meet our power couple Osiris. You've probably heard of this guy. He's like the most worshipped god in ancient Egypt. Ancient Egyptians revere him greatly, and that isn't a surprise. According to Egyptian mythology, Osiris is considered the god of death in the underworld. So if you really want to have a pleasant experience in the afterlife, you'd better be on good terms with this guy. He's also considered the god of crops and plentiful harvest. Weird contrast, right? Enter Isis, also one of the most important deities who is believed to possess great magical powers. Her worship is only rivaled by that of her husband. But here's the catch: Isis isn't just Osiris' wife, but also her sister. If the most famous couple in all of ancient Egypt were siblings, what else would you expect from the rest of the society? Egyptian pharaohs often took their own sisters and brothers as wives and husbands, a pattern modeled after this power couple. They believed that by engaging in incestuous marriages, they were following in the footsteps of the gods, embodying their power and observing the purest form of love. Strange things happened in ancient Egypt, right? But that's not all. The practice of inbreeding was not restricted to the royal families of Egypt. Even normal everyday people married their siblings in ancient Egypt. Fathers married their daughters, cousins married each other, brothers married sisters, and all of that. It was a whole lot of chaos that resulted in many deformities and abnormalities as the bloodlines progressed. Although we can't really get into the details of every single Egyptian family that was blood-related, that video will definitely be way too long. However, let us study the lives of some of these sibling couples as we attempt to get a broader understanding of their lifestyles and practices. Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Perhaps there is no greater example of inbreeding in ancient Egypt than the union of King Akhenaten with an unknown queen. The name of King Akhenaten is definitely not strange to you if you've got at least a vague idea of Egyptian history. After all, Akhenaten gave us one of the most famous pharaohs in all of ancient Egypt. Yeah, you guessed right. Enter King Tutankhamun, the enigmatic young king who became ruler of all of ancient Egypt at the tender age of 9, way back in 132 BC. So many things have been said about this king since his tomb was discovered in 22. His mummified remains provide us with the opportunity to trace his bloodline, and you should see the shock in the face of scientists when they discovered that King Tut was born from an incestuous marriage. No wonder he had club feet and a myriad of health problems that were common among inbred families. The life of King Tut was as tumultuous and mysterious as his death for many years. The circumstances surrounding his death have been a mystery to scientists. However, DNA studies and CT scans of his remains revealed that Tut had suffered from many ailments. These ranged from malaria to a generic bone disease to a cleft palate. All these were results of the fact that he had come from an inbred family. Even though historical accounts of ancient Egypt often depict the boy king as a strong, dazzling young ruler, this wasn't the case. According to scientific findings, he was probably crippled and had to walk with a cane. But why was the young, innocent king plagued by so many deformities and diseases? Well, scientifically, inbreeding carries a huge risk of transmitting serious health complications across generations. To put it simply, some genes responsible for some genetic diseases are usually dominant in some families. But when they start interbreeding and making babies among themselves, these genes can become dominant over time, manifesting in future generations as serious health complications that significantly alter the lives of these inbred children. King Tut is a typical example of this, and his life story provides us an opportunity to explore the practices that were commonplace in ancient Egypt. So who is this mystery woman who gave birth to one of the most enigmatic figures in ancient Egypt? To be very honest, we still haven't figured that out. However, what we do know is that King Akhenaten and Nefertiti were probably sisters, although some historical records seem to state otherwise anyways. Their marriage was all sweet and romantic except for one tiny detail. Nefertiti didn't have a son. Now, if you understand ancient Egyptian royalty, you must know how important it was to have a son as an Egyptian ruler. So what did Akhenaten do? Well, he did exactly what any Egyptian pharaoh would do. Akhenaten looked into his family and selected one of his sisters. Maybe not his full sister, or maybe it was. We do not know, but the union between the two siblings gave Akhenaten his first son, who ascended the throne after his demise just 9 years later. But that's not the end of this complicated web of inbreeding. When it was time for King Tut to take a wife for himself, he also looked inward by marrying his half-sister Ankhesenamun. Now this was the daughter of Nefertiti, King Akhenaten's primary wife, so that makes King Tut's stepmother, also his mother-in-law. This should paint a picture of how deeply ingrained this practice of inbreeding was in ancient Egypt. But King Tut wasn't the only one who was born out of a sibling's marriage. The next couple we are about to look into might shock you. Unraveling the enigma of the Ptolemy dynasty. Inbred history. Let us introduce you to one of the most powerful dynasties in ancient Egypt. Back in 305 BC, the responsibility of the rulership of this ancient civilization fell into the hands of a Macedonian Greek family known as the Ptolemy dynasty. They ruled the Ptolemaic kingdom during a period known as the Hellenistic period. For about 275 years, the reigns of this great kingdom were in the hands of these men and women whose inbreeding practices ran deep. But how did a Greek family become the ruling class of ancient Egypt? To find the answer to this question, follow us back in time to 323 BC. This was the year Alexander the Great died. During his lifetime, he was the conqueror and ruler of Egypt. But after he died, the responsibility of handling the administration of Egypt rested on the shoulders of one of Alexander's most trusted generals, who might also possibly be his half-brother. We're not really sure about this one. His name was Ptolemy, and as you might have guessed, he was the head of the Ptolemaic dynasty. In 3 or 5 BC, Ptolemy declared himself as Pharaoh Ptolemy I, even though he wasn't born an Egyptian. Left with no choice but to obey, the Egyptians accepted him as their ruler and his dynasty as the producer of the successors to the throne. As this dynasty grew, the practice of inbreeding became a common feature, including sibling marriage. Perhaps the most famous member of this family would be Cleopatra VII, known to be the most influential and most powerful queen to ever rule in ancient Egypt. Cleopatra was also a product of an incest marriage, as was customary at the time. All the ruling kings were named Ptolemy and their queens Cleopatra. So in case you thought this Cleopatra was the only Cleopatra, you're very, very wrong. Cleopatra VII was a product of a marriage between King Ptolemy the 11th or Ptolemy and his sister Cleopatra V. You shouldn't really be surprised that she went on to marry 2 of her own brothers, ruled alongside her 10-year-old brother Ptolemy the 13th before finally overthrowing him after winning a civil war. Back in these ancient times, marriage between siblings was considered the holiest form of love. It made them feel like the true embodiment of the gods that they were, and was considered an effective means of ensuring the continuity of the bloodline. But inbreeding was not only confined to the ruling houses of Egypt. A trip through the streets of ancient Egypt would reveal to you the extent to which inbreeding was celebrated among the ordinary families of Egypt. These ordinary people often resort to marrying from their own kin due to the unavailability of eligible spouses, as well as a means of preserving some desired traits within the bloodline. After all, when Octavian had them struck off, it was to commemorate Caesar's deification. Inbreeding carries a significant risk of transmitting serious genetic diseases. This is because it limits the available gene pool, which increases the chances that you will pass on some harmful traits which are recessive in the parents onto the child. Although such diseases may have not been observed in the generation before the inbreeding period, crossing genes with someone of your own blood increases the chances of activating some recessive genes and making them dominant. Throughout history, our civilization has been plagued with this anomaly. Thankfully, we know better now, and this practice is no longer considered a normalcy. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to explore. See you in the next one.